Are you there, Luxembourg? Can we have your vote?
I'm here. Hello.
There you are. Okay, right. So we're going over to Steph, and you've got a series of speakers, haven't you, with you this morning? And thank you very much for taking part. I'm off. See you later.
Cheers, Peter.
Have fun.
Just to say, it's absolutely wonderful to be here this morning. I'm so pleased that we're getting the opportunity to kind of be part of this absolutely brilliant conference, and a massive hats off to the organisers who've done an absolutely brilliant job. I don't think in the early days in January, when we were all kind of talking about this, that we'd ever imagined A, us to be in the middle of a pandemic, and B, for it to have got this kind of interest. And I guess that just shows how important this conversation is. And we're absolutely delighted to be involved in that today. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Steph, and I work for an organisation called the People's Powerhouse. Our work is about amplifying the voices of people across the north of England so that they get a say in the decisions that affect their lives. So earlier on this year, when me and Peter were kind of discussing this conference, I was really keen to bring together a group of people to discuss working class experiences, both of students and staff, and to give people the opportunity to share their own experiences and also ideas for how things might move forward and where we might be able to influence some change. So I was extremely fortunate to be able to bring together our wonderful panellists this morning, who is Andy Mycock. Andy, give us a wave. We've got James Coe, Sarah Ward, and Fraser Mycroft. There we go. Hi, Fraser. And I'm sure you're all really looking forward to their presentations this morning. So the format that we're going to take with the session is we're going to listen to all 4 presentations first, and then we're going to then have a joint Q&A panel session at the end, with lots and lots of time for questions. So we'll make sure that we kind of leave a good kind of 25 to 30 minutes for questions. So enough from me. I'm firstly going to hand over to Andy Mycock. So Andy is a reader in politics at the University of Huddersfield. His key research and teaching interests focus on post-imperial identity politics in the UK, including devolution politics, British war histories, and the war commemoration. He's also currently leading a Leverhulme Trust project on lowering the voting age in the UK, which is absolutely excellent work. This morning, Andy is going to be discussing the socialising effects of higher education on young people from working class backgrounds or who self-identify as working class. He will focus on the extent to which studying at university impacts on their democratic or political socialisation and how this influences their self-sense and group identities. So without further ado, Andy, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Steph. That's really kind. Good morning, everyone. This is a whole new world to me. I like to describe myself as a Betamax man in a VHS world, but I'm not sure in the modern thing that actually works, particularly with the young people I work with. It's a really interesting conference, and I've got to be honest that it's come at the right time. I grew up in a very mixed family, working class parents, but my mother married someone who was a lawyer, and I kind of grew up in a very strange world. I worked in a factory for 10 years before I went to university in the mid-20s, and that sense of identity crisis has always been there. I'm not quite sure that I'd ever describe myself as working class, but much of my own upbringing was in a working class environment, and as you get older in life, sometimes that can be difficult to navigate. And so in many ways, I'm alive to some of the issues that my working class students face. And this work is kind of grounded in two things, really. One is a wonderful article by Robert Granfield from 1991, where he talks about working class students making it or faking it at university. And my own experience at university felt very much like I was both making it and faking it at the time. The other is about more contemporary work I'm looking at, which is about the culture wars and campus wars. The idea that higher education is becoming politicised in terms of the way in which we're polarising politics after Brexit, and the binary sense in which civil society is fracturing on a number of key issues. And we're starting to see that more and more in universities. And I'm interested particularly in the way in which that affects working class students. And so that's my starting point. It kind of links to a Leverhulme project I've been doing, looking at lowering the voting age and the idea that transitions to adulthood begin much earlier for the current generation of young people. You know, they start transitioning, particularly young women, into adulthood at the age of 11 biologically, and those transitions can extend well into the late 20s and even early 30s. And so the idea that at 18 you suddenly magically become an adult, I think that argument has gone. And I'm particularly interested in terms of my students, who often report that they don't feel like they're adults because they don't feel like they're connecting with what society structures as adulthood, but at the same time they don't feel like they're youths. They don't feel like they're connected to those that are in secondary or primary or even further education. And there's this sense in which they're in a period of transition, waithood, that they are somehow still being socialised whilst they're at university. And that raises a number of questions about, some of it shows my age as well about my VHS joke, it does. Don't read the comments at the side when you're trying to present, by the way, it's too tempting. One of the things which is interesting is the idea that the university campus, I know James is going to talk about this. I'm really excited to be working with James and Sarah and Fraser and the young people from Reclaim, and particularly Steph and People's Powerhouse for putting this on. The idea that university campuses themselves as a place, as something that you look into from outside, and also as a space that you're in, have a socializing effect. The way in which particularly working class young people react to that space is distinctive and different when compared to those students that come from maybe more affluent, more privileged backgrounds, whose parents have been to university before. And I think that Sarah's going to be talking more about first generation challenges in learning, but there is something there about the way in which working class students are not socialized often in the same ways as their middle class counterparts in terms of the preparation for university. And that can be mainly in terms of the way in which they pick up opportunities, the way in which they engage with student life, but particularly because evidence suggests that many working class students don't typically residentially board at universities in the way in which maybe more other backgrounds do. So they're commuter students. And so they have tensions in the way in which they link their life at university to their family life, which they often are still experiencing, and also in terms of their community links, that they don't get the same distancing effect that those that go away to study. And so they're challenged in the way, in the fact that they're at university, that they're experiencing socialization, which may change the way in which they feel about themselves, the way in which they self-identify, and particularly the way in which they feel about the world politically, and the way in which they engage, but also in their peer groups of friends in their local community and the wider local community, that they're placed in a position where their values are often changing in some ways, or they're certainly in flow, they're being more malleable, but at the same time that they have these different elements outside of university life that actually situate them sometimes in a more conflictual, confrontational manner. I think the interesting thing about where we're at in terms of this idea of socialization is that there's a lot of research that already suggests that working class young students don't get the same sense of belonging at universities that maybe some of their more privileged counterparts have, that they don't integrate into the campus environment at the same level, they don't find the campus welcoming in the same way, and they find that many of those sort of social engagements, joining societies and things like that, they don't take the same, they don't get involved in the same level. And so they don't have the same kind of socializing experiences of other people. And more than that, they're not inducted in the same way. And so when we see young people arriving at university, they don't get any kind of extra help in terms of their induction to make them aware of many of these opportunities. So they learn during their time, and sometimes, in my experience is that you actually miss those opportunities because you're not aware of them until possibly it's too late. More than that, that they don't have the same peer groups, and they often find it very difficult to find other working class students with the same backgrounds and the same history, so they can connect with them at university to normalise this feeling, the sense that they're part of a wider community. They have very few reference points in terms of working class, self-identifying working class lecturers. And often even the modules that are designed are often drawn from and present a particular perspective on social and political issues, which are framed very much from a position which is not a working class position. So there are a lot of senses in which they're feeling that there is an outsider status rather than insider status on campus itself, and that many of those students themselves do not get involved in more of the diversity work that's on campus because they don't see class as one of those issues that typically is addressed in many of those exercises, particularly led by student unions. Why is that important? Well, I think that what you find there then is, in terms of cultural identity and learner identity, that working class students are faced with trying to fit in at a new environment within university, but also still trying to fit in with those established environments, the family home, within their local community, with their peer groups, with their friends, at a time of enormous transition, enormous change in the way in which they feel about themselves. And so it presents a number of challenges in the way in which they think. And quite often what happens is that these working class students learn to code switch. And so they start to develop hybrid multiple identities, which they realize in different ways at different times in different spaces. And the kind of identities that they project at university are often cauterized and not brought back into their communities. They change the way in which and that's an experience that I feel very strongly. I discovered over the years that I was an inveterate code switcher, and also you get in a sense of imposter syndrome, the idea that you're not being authentic to yourself, that your identity is somehow constantly being changed because of external influences, and you start to develop complex strategies that mean that you manage these situations in certain ways. One of the things that quite often happens is that working class young students start to cauterize their friend networks at home, and they start to isolate and exclude some of those former friends because they don't map into the way in which they perceive themselves as they're changing. But more than that, that there's this sense in which they developed hybrid identities, and Diane Ray, etc., have done some really good work on this, that there is a sense of hybrid identities that aren't equal, that one identity becomes more dominant than the other, and particularly if there's a sense in which a university identity is associated with things such as social mobility and different sort of more progressive sense of themselves, that they start to see that identity as a dominant identity compared to some of the more established identities. But this leads to this persistent sense of an emotional struggle around, well, what is authenticity? And it's going to be really interesting to listen to Fraser this morning, because he's just gone through an experience like this. And what I'm doing at the moment is doing some focus groups with students about how they're experiencing this, and particularly in terms of their political socialization. And the reason why I'm interested in this is largely around this conversation that's taking place at the moment about, has higher education expanded too much? Are there too many? And it's never fully said, but there is a sense in which some politicians think, are there too many working class students at university? And are they becoming too politically liberal? Are they becoming too woke, the snowflakes? We all know the narratives. Is university in some ways having a socializing effect, which is indoctrinal, which is encouraging young working class people to mirror and to pick up the behaviors of those lecturers and the environment on campus, and also the universities themselves as an institution, which are seen to be more liberal in many senses? Are they becoming indoctrinated by that general environment? And there is a lot of talk about this, particularly in the right-wing press, but there's actually very little evidence that this actually is something which happens. And so what I'm doing at the moment is starting a project which looks at, does university turn young people liberal? Does it turn them to the left? Does it turn them into the kind of more pejorative terms that we're more experienced for? What is the role of the lecturers? What are the role of the student unions? Well, one of the things we do know is that working class students tend not to join these formal groups in the same ways that maybe other students do. And so in some senses, they don't get involved in student politics in the more traditional sense at the same levels. That's not true. In some senses, and some working class young people do get involved very deeply in this. But they're presented with a challenge, which is about how do they map what they're doing at university with what they're doing outside their university? How does it affect their links to their family and their friends? And often it produces a series of choices that they either fight and they stand up and they project a very dominant sense of their own identity, their working class identity. They flee, that they backed off, and they become commuter students that simply go to campus, go to lectures, go back home into their community. They don't integrate at all. Or thirdly, they assimilate, that they become, they change the way in which they see the world, and they become part of the dominant culture, or what they perceive to be the dominant culture. I think it's interesting in some ways because student unions themselves are increasingly depoliticized, and particularly on post-92 campuses, where there's not the tradition of autonomy and independence. And so in some senses, the emerging issues around the campus wars at the moment, the idea about, what kind of identity politics should be embraced by students. Well, I'm not quite sure that that's an even effect across all universities. And I think one of the interesting things is that different universities in different places and different spaces have different effects in terms of their political engagement. to put it bluntly, there's not many people on the University of Huddersfield's campus talking about cancel culture at the moment. It doesn't resonate with many of the students in the same way, or it doesn't appear to. What I've been doing in terms of my work on this is to test to what extent do different groups of students relate to this effect of the potential political socialisation. Steph, how long have I got, by the way?
How long do you need?
About another 3 minutes and I'm done.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I usually overtalk. And what I'm looking at, I've deliberately been looking for different control groups of young people to think about how they react to the socialising effect. And the first case study group that I did some focus group work with was a group of young working class men who associate themselves as right-leaning, as conservative supporting students. And the things that came out there were very interesting in terms of the way they perceive themselves and the way they perceive the university. They often frame their own self-identity and collective political identity in terms of victimhood and grievance, that they were somehow being manipulated and overwhelmed by what they saw as an extremely intrusive and deliberately indoctrinal student union, and particularly the student union campaigns on things like LGBTQI+ rights, and some of the issues linked to the Black Lives Matter campaign were seen very much in terms of the idea that there was a dominant middle-class liberal student union culture which was imposing a political identity on these young people. And so they often reacted very strongly against that. And in many ways, the most interesting thing is that they argued that student union politics was unrepresentative of working class culture, that many of those young people felt that their community identities, and particularly their reference points in their communities, were normal, and that somehow what was happening on university campuses was in many ways abnormal, that it wasn't representative of their full society. They were politically active, but it was noteworthy that they were politically active not on campus, but in the community. So they chose to engage with where they thought politics was authentic, and that was a community-based activism. The second group was fascinating, and it's a group of working class young women that I engaged with, particularly just after the 2019 general election. And I held a workshop, a focus group, the day after the election, and it was visceral. And I had young women articulating a sense in which they had grievances both against their parents and their friendship peer groups outside of the university. Their parents, particularly because they saw their parents as degrading them, as saying that, well, they voted Labour because they were doing it for self-interest, because of student loan, the potential removal of tuition fees. And that in some ways they were naive. You know, one student reported that her father had called her stupid. They then found that when they tried to engage politically with their community, with their peer group friends, that they then reacted against them in a different way. And they often argued that those at university were somehow privileged. And when these young women started to argue, well, we're paying £27,000, we're taking an enormous amount of debt, this is not the privilege that it used to be, they related it to their own experience and says, well, I'm working for minimum wage, I'm working in Wilco's or whatever, you are very different. And so they find themselves isolated politically outside of the campus, and so that they tended to engage on the campus to a much greater extent, because they found there that they had a sense in which their political values and the way they saw the world were reinforced by the on-campus environment. And I think that's, at the moment, unfortunately, where I've almost got to, because unfortunately COVID came along and limited some of the research we were going to do, but we are going to carry on in the autumn when things are a little bit easier. It's clear, though, that the space and place of the university and the culture and environment produces diverse political reactions across different groups of working class students. Some who see the university higher education environment very much as challenging and confronting their set of values and the way in which they see the world, and others seeing it very much as confirming and then seeing their own communities and their own families to be the outsider groups in many ways. And I think the point of this, which I think is most interesting, is that it highlights that in some ways, it isn't the traditional socializing effects of formal politics, student politics, which is changing people. It's what's happening in a much wider sense about what's happening on campus, and making young people react in different ways, working class young people. And it still raises a question. And so what we're going to do taking this work forward is to continue on and think about this question about, does university change working class young people's political socialization? And if it does, how and in what ways? And it's quite clear that what we know from the initial focus groups have done, this is not a universal or uniform effect. And the interesting thing going forward is going to be, well, to what extent can we start to detect that there are subgroups that do act in more collective and coherent ways? Steph, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. That was absolutely brilliant. And I can see like the chats just exploded with loads of people agreeing and adding their own experiences. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody, by the way. Thank you for those. I will collect those. That's really kind.
So up next, taking us forward is James. So we have James Coe. He's the Senior Policy Advisor at the University of Liverpool, where he works on issues of higher education and public policy. He's also today as part of his role at the People's Powerhouse on the strategic board, and I get the absolute delight and pleasure of working with him very often. As well as his professional roles, James is currently studying for a Master in Public Administration at the University of York. His interests lie in how public institutions can use their position to reduce local and regional socio-economic inequalities. That was a mouthful. In his presentation today, he's going to briefly touch on the impacts of higher education as a social leveller and the enhanced role he believes universities can play in the economic fortunes in the places they are based, and therefore providing greater opportunity for all. So yeah, really, really fascinating. I'm really excited to hear what James has to say. He's also told me if you want to tweet him, you can find him at James_Co1. So yeah, get tweeting as well, guys. Right, over to you, James.
Cheers, Steph. Thank you for that. I included the Twitter just to form a bit of a comparison with Andy's use of VHS and Betamax to get that in early on. So thank you for that. Cheers for having me, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen so I get the presentation up I'm going to talk to. So thanks very much for the introduction, Steph. That was really generous. And as I said, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think as I was looking through Twitter yesterday and seeing all the discussions you've been having, it was really apparent to me that this was not only an overdue conversation, but one that's absolutely vital in the way we conceptualise working class cultures and the way it impacts on universities. I could not agree more with that sentiment which someone expressed yesterday, that identifies working class as more than the way we cut our sandwiches. I thought it was an absolutely wonderful motif and a way to think about it. Today, I suppose, what I'm going to talk about is not only my experience as a working class student in higher education, but the ways in which I think universities can address wider social inequalities. And like Andy was saying, I suppose I find myself approaching this topic from a bit of a mixed point of view. I feel like I have a somewhat conflicted identity, as I've seen many of you reflect in the chat. I identify as being profoundly working class. It is something which I culturally identify with, but also stems from my family background. But equally, I find that I almost experience this working class identity as an outsider looking in. It feels like something which has informed my past and who I am today. But as to how much this is an ongoing and effective identity, I'm less sure. I'm sure, like many of you, I find myself therefore at a crossroads, thinking deeply how my working class identity impacts everything I do, while simultaneously wondering, am I turning into a class imposter? Or indeed, am I thinking too much about it? Or what does it even mean to be working class? So I want to start off by saying there is clearly no homogenous working class identity. In an attempt to do so, we either over-romanticize it or we underplay it. Even worse, we've missed the multiple identities that go into being working class, or we miss some vital comparison. But what I think is really important to draw out is that I believe I only became firmly aware of my working class identity at the point I went into university. It was only the point I received a bursary for good A-levels and my economic background, where something occurred to me saying that being clever and not very well off is actually a unique marker. Until then, I'd grown up in sunny Darlington in the northeast. My friends were like me, my teachers were like me, my history teacher had come from a pea shelling factory through adult education to teaching us our A-levels. It was a very, very deeply working class experience. My cultural outlook was informed by this as well. For 19 weekends a year, my dad would make me suffer by going to watch Newcastle with his work friends, a working class experience again and again. And it was only when, I think very late to my university experience, after I'd received my bursary, I said earlier, I found myself in my literature class reading Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. And I suddenly felt a real sense of dissonance. To be reading a firmly working class text, up until on that point, it had been a profoundly middle class experience. And I must be honest that in my university, I feel really privileged. I went to the University of Liverpool as a student, and I enjoyed it so much I continue to go there now. But my question is, if I feel like that on an individual level, what are the wider social indicators, and what systematically could universities do to think of wider social inequalities? So today I'm going to touch on three things. What does the rising tide look like in entry into higher education? I won't touch on class at first, but looking at wider social inequalities as a means to think, is university the great leveller? Then, as Andy said in his talk, to look at the ongoing debate between what is higher education for and who is benefiting from it. And then finally, I want to touch on how I believe universities can be a magnet institution that draws benefits to their region and improve the lot of the people who live there. And I think sometimes we can get caught up with universities as institutions, but I want to start off with my profound belief that a more equal education system is good for society as a whole. Education progress, class progress, and equality are intimately linked, as Wilkinson and Pickett showed in the Spirit Level. And there is a narrative. You remember very clearly Tony Blair's "We want 50% of people in higher education." And in part this has happened, but who it has happened for is equally important. The data in front of you shows higher education based on polar quintile. For those who aren't aware, polar data is an amalgamation of postcode data based on participation in higher education. And what we have found is that although there is increased participation in higher education across all of these groups, it has not moved between groups in a dramatic way. This means that we may be closing gaps overall, but relatively, gaps still remain. And fair enough, you may say to me, okay, if lower postcode data has lower entry in higher education, well, then that's somewhere inevitability. However, if we look at other measurements, including MEM, which is the multiple equality measure, which takes in a range of factors from students, including their socioeconomic background, ethnicity, and indices of multiple deprivation, we find that the more granularly we look into a student's socioeconomic status, the less likely they are to attend higher education, with high ratios existing between the two. Or even if we take the crudest measure of students who receive free school meals and those who do not, as a measure of entry into higher education, we again find that the gaps are not closing at a particularly quick rate. Having closed relatively entry rates by 0.6% in 13 years, we are looking at something like another 120 years before we close that rate completely. And I just want to pause on this, and I think it's important we don't conflate working class identities with wider socio-economic inequalities. But one of the things I firmly believe is centred within my working class identity is a belief in equality of opportunity, and a belief that actually going to university was an opportunity to get on. It was somewhat unusual in the part of the town I grew up in, but it was something which was drummed into me as an early age. Another couple of things which I think are interesting. In order to make that ambition a reality, it requires specific fiscal interventions. Postgraduate education rates only equalised and then took over for the students who are in the lowest participation postcodes on the introduction of postgraduate loans. It took an immense financial change. What we still find, however, is even if you get in and even if you get on, there is a change between highly skilled work and degree classifications. Roughly speaking, if I get a first class degree, I have a reasonable chance of what's classified as highly skilled work. However, if I get a lower second or a third, I'm disproportionately punished, if you will, based on the background. And I say this to highlight that disparities exist, but I should put this into the frame that I believe universities can be a profoundly transformative experience. And this depends how we look at it. Earnings are significantly higher for graduates than for non-graduates, and students from Russell Group institutions, not counting the wider inequalities that exist there, and in attendance in particular, are higher than for non-Russell Group graduates. As we said before, entry into there is the key for me. So we find ourselves in a situation where universities can have transformative impacts on attainment, entry, qualification, and life chance. However, if we do not equalise that for all, then what is the benefit? And it's really important to say that most people think likewise. The Millennium Cohort Study found that no less than 97% of mothers wanted their children to go on to university. This was true across class, and even those who had not attended university themselves, 96% of this cohort wanted their children to go. It is a nationwide ambition that we should go to university. The question is, how can we use the university itself as an institution and its position to bring greater equality of opportunity for all? In their work, Social Mobility and Its Enemies, Lee Elliott Major and Steve Mechin looked at what are some of the barriers that I've addressed. And they come back with three. An emphasis on earnings within higher education leads to questions of programs and their value based on income. Secondly, that despite the expansion of HE, the graduate gap between the most highly paid, the graduate gap between the most privileged and least privileged on entering HE has widened. And finally, although the entry gap has narrowed, it has not done so at the most prestigious university. The most optimistic view which I present of universities is that people get in and has transformative impact on their life. The most negative view is that we are living within a polarised system where working class students are routinely disadvantaged from taking part. And then to move away from social inequalities more generally and pick up Andy's point, looking particularly at working class experiences. We are part of an ongoing debate that seems to have been going on almost forever about are simply too many people going to university. And there are two things we should be absolutely clear about. The target of 50% going to people in university never existed. It was 50% of people going to higher education. And I believe that distinction is important because we talk less of the types of education we have and put it in the whole. What I think is really important is that we look at the nature of provision as a means of breaking down class boundaries, as has been discussed in the chat. Secondly, if we are saying not 50% of people need to go to university, then you need to decide who that is and what they do instead. If we are saying, I think higher education is important, then that's fine across the piece. If we are saying higher education is important for my children, then that's a very different debate. And I sometimes worry we go down that route. And finally, we should not pit higher education and further education against each other. I think higher education has a transformative role in the place they are based, but further education is incredible for skills development, pathways, and being transformative qualifications in and of themselves. I don't have a position that I think more education is a bad thing. And I think as working class academics and people interested in this space, we should defend that as a concept. So on to my final 2 points. What can universities do directly for working class students? I think the first tranche of activity is that there is direct activity universities undertake in order to support entry. This can be financial support, in the example I gave earlier of my bursary, information, advice and guidance. So in part, this is the formal outreach activity universities do. But I think there's a powerful role for peer mentoring to hear from other working class students about their experiences and how they can get on. Thirdly, there's mentoring, which universities put in place alongside student support, and summer schools to expose students to activities on campus. I think all this is excellent, but I want to finish on the point that alone, this will not be enough to close the gaps. And instead, in order to bring true equality, and indeed to bring a working class lens and to engage with our working class communities properly, we need to conceive universities not as anchors in some way holding down the place they are based, but magnets who have a unique power to attract different outlooks and perspectives to their institutions. And I think we can do this in 5 ways. So firstly, in research and development. Of course, where research is published and who it is published by and its quality are always going to be strong academic factors. However, recent research has looked at where we can choose to invest to reduce wider social inequalities. This does not necessarily advocate investing at the cutting edge, but investing in a broad base. This may be where there are large numbers of employers. As part of their civic engagement, I'd be interested to see the universities that consider how their research investment and where they choose to spend can support local supply chains and the local jobs market, as well as bring expertise into their local area. I think the second area where universities can explore is that they are profoundly cultural institutions. We produce cultures through our galleries, museums, but who are those cultures? Who is producing them? And how can we give a greater platform to working class cultures through our output? At the moment, the University of Liverpool is running a website called Culture at Home, which is designed to connect people during COVID. It has an explicit intention to think about different cultures. Thirdly, in employment and skills, there is distinct gaps between students based on their socio-economic status and what they achieve. I think it would be appropriate for universities to consider explicit programs that target students who enter university without the same levels of cultural capital. This should not be patronising, and it should not be seen as an outreach or doing a favour, but something which is built with the needs of those students in mind. And the last two I'd like to touch on is that universities have huge financial clout. They can procure a lot of things. In the wake of the financial crash, in the way that Preston Council remodelled their work to buy local and support their local communities, I think there's a role for universities to do likewise. And I think finally, crucially, and the most intangibly, the cultures which we replicate on campus are important. It is incumbent on all of us to not only be proudly working class, to encourage the people after us, but to think how we encourage more working class cultures on our campus in whatever form they take. So to finish off, I think universities can be transformative. I think there's work for us to do in order to encourage access. And I think thinking of our wider working class experiences, there's a role for us all to push our institutions to address wider inequalities on our doorsteps. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, James. And there's been a lot of love for your co-presenter, Jarvis, who's been making an appearance in the chat. Oh, there we go. We get to see him in all his glory. So just before we move on, I know we're not doing questions now, but somebody asked in the chat, what was the book that you were reading at university when you had your kind of working class epiphany?
Oh, sorry, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning by Alan Sillitoe.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks so much, James. That was absolutely brilliant. And I think everybody loves a graph, and we got a lot of graphs. I say it's never too early for a graph. And also, I'm really interested in exploring kind of what universities' place is in the places that they're in. And I think that, you know, that conversation being moved towards universities understanding that they are based in communities and therefore have a responsibility to the communities that they're based in is something that's hugely fascinating to me, and beyond just kind of economic transactions, but also cultural and social transactions, I think is something that is hugely fascinating, and I often talk about myself. So thanks very much for that, James. So up next, without further ado, we have Sarah Ward, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Huddersfield. She is currently undertaking research exploring the experience of students who are first in their family to go to university. Today, she's going to discuss the importance of moving away from discourses of deficit to understanding what these students bring to the table. So over to you, Sarah.
So yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk a bit today about my PhD research specifically. And thank you to Steph, Andy and James for inviting me on to be involved with this. It's a really exciting opportunity to speak about my research. So firstly, I want to just set the context a little bit about why I think this research is important. And that's because parental education remains a key indicator as to whether their children are likely to go to university. Now, there's not really a unified definition of first in family or first generation students. There is a little bit of variation, but the common definition is that first in family students are those whereby no one in their immediate family, often including siblings as well as parents, have previously attended university. So what I found as one of the problems in the existing research is that it tends to focus on the barriers that are faced by first in family students when accessing the traditional and middle class domain of the university. So I wanted to move beyond that to understand how they are actually successful. And I also just want to note at this point that it's important not to conflate the terms first in family with working class. Although a lot of first in family students are from a working class background and a lot of working class students are first in their family. So whilst I do want to move away from these discourses, it is important to highlight some of the barriers that they come up against. And Andy mentioned quite a few of these in when he was talking about it. But to start with, first in family students are more likely to study less prestigious courses at less prestigious institutions. So here we use the term prestige mainly to refer to kind of the university league table definition of prestige rather than any other kind of valuation. They also tend to have less involved parents around the decisions to do with higher education. So this is both in terms of kind of institution and subject choice, as well as whether to even go to university at all. They're often found to also have a lack of preparedness and skill when they enter higher education. And this often means that it takes longer for them to adapt to the environment. It takes longer for them to learn how to ask for help and how to kind of conduct their assignments and things like that. They're also found to have a lack of time for engaging in the environment. So that's both in terms of the academic study and in extracurricular activities, something which Andy also mentioned. So that's things like the societies and other social activities. There's also found this disjunction between their expectations and reality. Now, I know that's probably similar for a lot of students, but how they perceive university is going to be is a lot different when they actually get there. They often come up against a lot of additional time and stress kind of pressures that they previously kind of unanticipated. One of the big areas is to do with identity and not fitting in. And again, Andy spoke a lot about this. They tend to have this sense of feeling uncomfortable with the background in terms of trying to fit that into the middle class domain of university. So a lot of these factors it's suggested that they come down to that there's a high proportion of sort of part-time students, there's a high proportion of commuter students, and there's a high proportion of students that have additional family and caring responsibilities. And all these kind of factors combine, and it's suggested that these lead to a higher risk of attrition. So as we can see from these things, a lot of the research does focus on what they're lacking, what they're deficient in, what barriers they face, and these are definitely important issues. We need to understand what barriers people face so that we can try to reduce them. But what I wanted to do with my research was to go beyond this and to understand how they're actually successful, to try and move those discourses on a little bit. So my research asks, what factors enable first-in-family students to be successful in higher education? So my sample for this research was 30 first-in-family postgraduate students at post-1992 university in the north of England. So I decided to have a sample of postgraduate rather than undergraduate students, because I was working on the premise that postgraduate students have already achieved some level of success in higher education. So they've managed to access the environment, they've managed to navigate through the environment and come out with the degree. But further to that, they've actually wanted to stay in higher education. For whatever reason, they've wanted to continue and be successful in that environment. So I conducted semi-structured interviews with my participants, and we focused on kind of family background, educational trajectory, and their experience at university. So the theoretical underpinning for my research draws on the theory of capital by Bourdieu. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of the theory, so I won't bore you too much with the details, but I'm kind of basing it on the three main types of capital, which are economic, cultural, and social. So economic referring to access to income and possessions, cultural referring to knowledge and skills and things like that, and social relating to kind of networks and relationships that they have access to. So when discussing first-in-family students in terms of the theory of capital, they often place these students as lacking in capital. But the problem I find with that is that we all have types of capital. We all have varying levels of capital. The problem arises between the type of capital that you have and whether it is valued in the place where you need it to be valued. So, you know, in the discussions around capital and first-in-family students, they suggest that they don't have the capitals that are needed for university. But what they do have are some capitals, they're just not the ones that are traditionally valued in university. So at the moment, I'm in kind of my initial stages of analysis. But what I wanted to do today was to just share a few quotes with you from my data and my participants that highlight some of the things that they bring to higher education that enable them to be successful, but are not things that you would maybe traditionally class as something which are valued in that environment. So the first one is here. So the one thing that I think that always sticks in my head is like, you don't want to be like me and your mum. So I'm guessing that's one thing. He's like, school is your chance to become, it's your foreground to become better and achieve what you want. And then I did start to listen to him and thought, yeah, I don't want to be like my mum. I don't want to be buttering sandwiches. So she did further go on to say later, not that there's anything wrong with buttering sandwiches, but she's drawing on these discussions with her family who value education, regardless of the fact that they have lower levels of education themselves. So what she's actually doing with that is using that as inspiration and a motivator to enter higher education and to be successful from it. It's increasing her aspirations and increasing her kind of strive for social mobility. The second quote I want to share with you is this. I've always been quite outspoken and quite like, I say it as it is. They got to know that I were right, I don't understand this, sort it out or explain it to me or whatever. Whereas they'd be like, oh, I'm supposed to know, and we're more embarrassed to ask questions. And I was like, I don't care if you think I'm thick, just explain. I'd rather have someone think I'm thick, but then be able to do the assignments than sit and think I've no idea what we're supposed to be doing. So here she refers to herself as being outspoken, which I think has often got quite negative connotations. But what she's actually drawing on in the context of this quote is her experiences in earlier education, where she learned that not being outspoken wasn't the way that she would learn. The only way that she could learn was to not be afraid and to be confident that she didn't care whether people thought she was thick. She just wanted to, actively engage in the learning experience. So the third and final quote I'm going to share with you is this. So to come as far as I've come from a background that I've come from, you have to be bloody tenacious. You have to be like a dog with a bone with it. And I think you always have to come back to why you did it in the first place. If you lose that fire for why you're doing what you're doing, then you'll disengage from it. So in the context of this quote, she's been talking about how stubborn she is. And she's been talking about this in the context of her background, her family background. So by her words, she had a poor family background. And I mean, not necessarily in terms financially, but in terms of a negative experience of growing up and also a negative experience of education. But what she found by overcoming all these hurdles and barriers earlier in other parts of her life, she built up this level of resilience that enabled her to successfully participate and feel empowered in an environment which was potentially kind of unfamiliar and challenging. And like she says, you can't lose that fire for why you're doing what you're doing. And why she was doing this was to provide a better family, a better life for her children than the life that she had when she was younger. So what I hope these quotes have started to kind of highlight, albeit maybe on a basic level, is that first and family students draw on a lot of things which are maybe not traditionally acknowledged within higher education environments. So I want my research to move away from a place where we put first and family students as deficient and move to a place where we understand and we recognise first and family students as a legitimate group with attributes that need to be nurtured. So in terms of the theory of capital, I also want to move away from a place where we see them as lacking in capital and move to a place where we understand how the capitals that they do have access to are used, invested and converted to be successful. So in going forward, and a little bit about what James was talking about there in how institutions can nurture underrepresented students in the environment, I think from the angle that I'm trying to take here is kind of any special programs that we put in place within universities really need to be careful not to place the individual at blame and not to place the individual as being deficient in skills. We need to make sure that we change the learning environments that they are recognised as legitimate participants there and not as a side group of students who need this massive level of support to enable them to be successful. That was a bit of a quick tour, and I think I'm well under time there, but thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to reading the comments and Q&A later.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was absolutely brilliant, and I am hugely fascinated and a fan of the work that you've been doing. I think this idea of kind of changing the narrative around cultural capital so that actually those things are seen as a positive rather than a negative, and something that I've been kind of grappling with whilst we've been having our own conversations in preparation with this is, do you prepare students for universities or should we be preparing the universities for students? Now, my view is that it should be the latter and that actually we shouldn't be having to put people on special programmes to be ready for university. Instead, it should be about the university being ready and able to accept students from all walks of life. And that's a much more difficult task, I think. But the emphasis of responsibility should be on the university and not an 18-year-old student and possibly a family hasn't experienced education before. And so your work around kind of understanding and unpicking some of that is hugely fascinating, and I hope we'll work towards actually making a change at some point in the future. So thanks so much, Sarah, and we look forward to having you back up as a panellist in a few moments. So lastly, we have Fraser Mycroft. Fraser has recently graduated from Edinburgh University. We thought it was really important as part of our session to include a perspective of someone who has just experienced being working class through university. Fraser's going to share some of his thoughts and experiences, as well as reflecting on what we've heard from some of the other three speakers. Over to you, Fraser.
Cool. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Is it all okay? Great. So just a big thank you, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this space. It's the first time I've done anything like this, so please bear with me because I am bloody terrified. Also, like Rachel said in her keynote, I am a sorry excuse for millennial. There's no presentation from me. You just have to look at my face, I'm afraid. But I promised I shaved and washed, so it's not going to be too awful for you. Just to start with, a big part, I think, of the sheer fear that I had in, and I have right now in doing this, is that actually being in this great space with Steph and Andy and Sarah and James and everyone else who's spoken, I feel on the brink of being apologetic being here, taking up this space, these wonderful speakers. Like, I have had a lot of issue recently calling myself an academic. I'm not working in academia right now. I've not written any books or anything, but I am an academic, and I have started to re-own that in myself. I graduated last year, like Steph said, and the moment I handed in my last essay, I was like, God, I need some money. I am skint. So I got a job the exact same day, and I've been working in the restaurant ever since and really enjoying it. But that doesn't mean that I'm not an academic. I'm 23 now. I've spent, well, since maybe I was like 5 or 6, being examined and doing essays and working in an academia setting non-stop. So if that doesn't make me an academic, I don't know what does, really. But questioning why I felt so reluctant to see myself as an academic, I am very defiantly queer, I'm very defiantly northern, I am aggressively defiantly working class. So why am I still being apologetic? And actually being in this space is helping me to realize that I don't need to be, and I can own that. So thank you to everyone. Guess I'll start a bit more about myself and how I got here. Pretty standard working class lad background from one of the former coalfields of South Yorkshire, single parent family, you know, showed some intelligence at writing, so was pushed and pushed to achieve by society, by the education system, by my family, by everyone. And then actually really shocked a lot of people when I decided to go to Edinburgh Uni and study social anthropology, which is the poshest subject I think I've ever come across in my life. I love it. It's got a great place in my heart, but it was quite a shock to a lot of people. I didn't quite realize it was such a middle class subject until I first got to Edinburgh. I was already scared. I was in a new country. Felt like I was really far away from home, surrounded by really well-meaning middle-class women from the south of England. So I was one of the only boys, one of the only northerners, probably the only working-class person on my degree. And I just kind of wondered how I got in. You know, I was maybe a bigger fish in a small pond back home, and now I was smaller than a small fish. It was like a plankton in this massive lake of people. I knew that positive discrimination probably played quite a big part in that. You know, my postcodes, my man, all worked in my favor. But what I'm starting to realize is that I was a success story in that sense, but the support stops once you get into university. There's still, like James said, some of that financial support, especially from a really rich university like Edinburgh, but nothing else, because you've already beaten the odds and broken your class chains, and that's it. Now you're left to it. And that is what is so difficult. to say it's not as if I had a super hard time. I've loved my 4 years at university. I met some great people, done some amazing things. I appreciate that I'm not a first generation student. My mum went to uni, and actually her working in these education circles, which, as I'm sure we all know, can be very middle class circles, I actually had the skills given to me by her to be able to navigate myself in these circles, to hold my confidence in them. So I'm lucky in that sense. So it does come with its own issues though. And that's what I've had to patch up with myself since leaving university, is again, what actually I think Andy, Sarah and James all touched upon, which is losing this identity that you have and losing that working classness, because in the eyes of society and education, you're not working class anymore. You've been bettered and you've been lifted up. But I'm not middle class either. I can't pretend to know or understand all of the things that middle class people will have had growing up and experienced. So I just got a couple of anecdotes really just to share with you that probably stood out from my time at university. When I first got here, I joined a music theatre society, what I love doing. And the first social was a Chavs and Neds themed social. So Neds being the Scottish equivalent of Chavs. Spent hours and hours on the phone to my mum, just almost in tears, like, what do I do? These people might be my friends for 4 years. I'm really lonely. I need to make some friends, but I don't want to sell myself out. This feels really awful and uncomfortable. And eventually figured it out, and I went dressed as myself. And when someone asked me why I wasn't dressed up, I looked them in the eyes and I said, but I'm working class. Is this not what you meant? I've just come as me, mate. And actually, it's really funny, the girl who organised this social, about a year later, we're really close friends, and she actually approaches me to have this conversation about that social and actually how awful she feels about it. And so we sat down, and like a classic left-wing working class lad, I was like, here's an Owen Jones article. This'll be it. Give this a read. Talk to me. And it just shows that people do change, but just as working class people are not given the tools to discuss our own identity, middle class people aren't either. And so it's a really tricky narrative, especially being surrounded by so many middle class people, because you can't be mad at them for not having the tools, but they have to figure it out for themselves. And I guess I wanted to talk quickly about social anthropology, as I touched upon, very, very middle class subject, and what it's like to be a working class kid from the north doing this. Anthropology is really big on the other. You know, it's got a lot of its own issues born out of colonialism, rich white middle class cis men going and talking about the savages and the others and continuing to push us apart into these categories. I remember actually halfway through my second year, it's something similar to what James said, actually, that getting that firmly working class text put in front of you and you realizing, oh shit, I'm different. So it's halfway through my second year, and it was Learning to Labour by Paul Willis, a book written in, I think, 1975, an ethnography on working class boys in the North. And I remember just sitting there and being like, wow, is this it? Is this the only thing about working class people that I will read? And it wasn't even for an accredited course, it's for a fundamentals writing course. And that's all I'm going to get in terms of representation. And it was written, 20 years before I was born? None of that is applicable to me and my life and my communities. And I did four years in total at uni, and that was the only book on working class people. And I remember thinking about my dissertation and the research I was going to do, being actively discouraged from looking in on my own community. I think it's something that Jenny spoke about in her talk yesterday. Actually, her ethnography to me is so exciting, but that kind of thing would not have been allowed by my tutors because it was not the other. And so it wasn't proper anthropology. And there's something just really twisted about that. And it really put me off my subject for so long, and I had to re-find that love for it. And I guess the last anecdote I've got is in my fourth year, going to meet a personal tutor who we met maybe once a year to check that I was actually doing work, and 5-minute chat, that's it. And at the end of the chat, he actually asked me why I think that there are not more boys and more working class people and people from my background in my degree and in the General School of Social Political Sciences. And I was floored, and I was like, you have to ask me? You're the person with a doctorate. You're the person running these departments. And you're asking me as if I will have any idea. I'm just trying to work my way through. And so afterwards, I emailed him and I was like, look, I'm happy to help. Let me know what you want me to do, what you want me to work on. No reply. Nothing. So how can you expect working class people to get involved? You ask them to fix it for you, and then you don't listen to what they have to say. So just touch again, I spoke about like people not having the tools, working class people, middle class people, not having the tools to discuss their own class identity, especially at university. And actually with my group of really lovely middle class friends, I can sit and talk about sexuality and gender and race and all these amazing things, but not class. So actually I spent 4 years squishing what I wanted to talk about and hiding that. And the impact actually that I found that has had in the years since I've graduated, trying to grasp back my working class identity, because I'm not middle class, but I'm not working class anymore. And that was what's a really upsetting thought to try and have. So again, it's something that James said that really struck with me. It was the idea of being at this crossroads, and something that Eileen in her talk yesterday spoke about, the feeling of never quite belonging. I think of it as a no man's land. Since graduating, you are kind of in between these two classes, and you can't get back to the one that you were, and you can't become the one that you're not. And it's a fight that you feel that you're alone and you're trapped, and there's just no one there who understands it. And the idea of giving up parts of my identity that I've grown with to fit in with people back home, and giving up parts of my identity that's in me to fit in with people that I've met here. And it happens with our own communities as well. It's not just the education system that tries to do this. Our own communities push us, like something that Sarah said in her research, that push to be better and to achieve what people hadn't achieved. I remember my gran saying to me in my last year, "You won't move back here, will you, love? Don't do it." And it's heartbreaking. You know, you have bettered yourself and you've been this success story, but then you're left here just trying to figure it out on your own. But this is what I've found coming into this space, which I never thought I would find. So I do some thinking, environment, solidarity things every couple of weeks with an amazing group of working class people who actually push each other and push me to realize that we're not alone in this. And this is what this whole conference has created. And I'm so grateful to be asked to talk and be part of this, because actually this is what we have to be for each other so that we're not left alone. I am working class, and I will be until I die. That feeling of other people always telling you what you are, what you like, what you think. If you don't fit into that system you've been so lucky to get to, then you have to change. And where that leaves you afterwards, I don't know. I'm trying to grapple my way out of that hole. But the big thing that I take from that is, why are we not asked? And when we are asked, why are we not listened to? Why is our so-called social mobility decided for us? Because that's never going to be fair. I am working class and I am an academic, and I'm starting to realize that I can keep being both. And that is such an emotional and amazing feeling. But in order for this to happen, without all the emotional baggage that is piled on working class students, that drains us and destroys us and just breaks us down, we need to be included as more than a token, or more than just a throwaway success story. And maybe then future generations, our kids, my kids, won't have to fight alone. Thank you. I think that's me.
Wow, absolutely amazing, Fraser. I feel like if we were actually in a room with you, we'd be all on our feet right now, like clapping and whooping. So I'm not sorry you're not able to experience that in real life, but if you have a look at the chat, you'll see that there is a virtual standing ovation happening right now. Thank you so much for taking part and being so willing to really open up and share your experience. And I hope what that has done is really just reignited the fire within all of us to understand this is exactly why we're here. And like, we can talk in academic terms and we can talk in reflective terms, but actually if there are still students going through university now that are having your experience, hundreds, thousands of them, then this is a conversation that is well overdue and one that we really need to have. So, you know, huge gratitude for you for coming on and sharing, and big thank you to Becky for Reclaim putting us in touch with you.
Thank you.
And I think like a big standout thing from a number of conversations that I've had around this in the build up to coming today is like the number of people that end up going through therapy just because of their experience of university. Like, is that just like a given? Like, you go to university and you work in class and you have to go to therapy in order to deal with that once you get out of the other end of it because of your class? And if that's the case, then there's something seriously wrong in kind of people's expectations and experiences. So thank you very much. Right, this now brings us to our Q&A session. We've got 24 minutes in order to rattle through some questions, and I can see that the Q&A function is starting to populate nicely. Do I need to do? And so there are some specific questions here for some specific people that maybe we'll just get started on. So there's one for Sarah. So it says, Sarah, I'm currently working on my thesis looking at the creation of social networks by working class students. What do you think about the ways in which, through their own collaborative learning, they create their own social capital that enables success? What do you think about the ways, in which, through their own collaborative learning, they create their own social capital that enables success? Sarah?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for my participants, they were specifically the postgraduate, but they were first in family to go to an undergraduate course. So prior to university, I find kind of the social capital was very much limited. And in terms of how that enabled them to go to university, they didn't really have any networks as such. And one of the interesting things is that it was often like a key individual and almost down to luck as to whether they were kind of encouraged and given that confidence to go to university. So, for example, one of them had a tutor who gave her, you know, she submitted assignment at college and they said, you know, if I didn't know any better, I'd think this was university standard. And she's there going, you know, don't be stupid. Completely in disbelief and feeling embarrassed in her class because this tutor had pulled her out on this. But for her, for example, that's what gave her the confidence to go to university. So I think that's the type of social capital. And similarly for kind of drawing on peer groups. So a couple of them referred to kind of their friends who they identified, not through the exact terms, but who I would say were middle class, from a middle class background, who were going to university and talking about all the exciting things that university was going to be for them. And, you know, for them, it was just natural that they were going to go to university. And they almost drew on that relationship with their friends to kind of encourage them to go. They're going, you know, they're off to do it, so why can't I go to do it? So I think pre-university, they were key kind of forms of social capital, but they were very much kind of luck. It was down to luck as to whether they came across those specific relationships that gave them that to encourage them to go to university. I think whilst they're at university, and I don't know if this is specific to my group of my sample who were postgraduate students, but they very much didn't really talk about much of the social side. They all kind of talked about this sense that they were very much working alone and that they didn't adhere to this kind of usual student life of going out and, you know, going on bar crawls and those kind of relationships with peers. But they did talk a lot about having good relationships with tutors and with lecturers, and kind of not being afraid to go and speak to the tutors. You know, a lot of them said, oh, I just used to go and turn up at the door. And a lot of them got invaluable kind of experience from that. And again, in the transition to postgraduate study, a lot of them mentioned specific people, you know, specific interactions where they've been encouraged to apply to kind of postgraduate study. So I think for my sample of students, didn't draw on much social capital from anywhere really. It was very much these kind of one-off kind of interactions, and yeah, very much down to luck, I was finding, which is a little bit scary really.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. So our next question is from Lisa McKenzie, and it's a very interesting one, and I'd be really interested to hear what the panelists think. I think, if we don't mind, if we go to Fraser first, do you think we need working class universities or places of education that are specifically for working class people? Tough question, sorry.
Ooh, I'm not sure. I think I see the complete benefit of it. I see how nice and comforting that would be to be around people and to discuss these ideas, that you don't have to figure them out by yourself. But I also see how the way that universities are set up in this country and everywhere, the way that different universities have different things and different levels of things. I think I would say that more needs to be done at the minute into just supporting working class students at all universities, because that's actually a big thing, and it shouldn't. I know people who came to Edinburgh University because of the theatre scene and the student theatre. And, you know, there's lots of different things for different reasons people want to go. And I think I would spend more time trying to just make them more accessible and support kids through them.
Could we go to Andy next on that question, please?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. There's a sort of case there about, you know, do you give up on the formal structure of higher education that we have and develop something which which is sectional? I'm not convinced it's probably the right idea, because it almost sort of signs a sort of an element of defeatism in some sense, that you can't change the culture of higher education as it is now. And I think if you probably applied that to other areas like Black Lives Matters and, you know, the growing diversity in other areas, and said, well, would you have black universities, etc., I think a lot of people would find that uncomfortable. So I think it's probably in the same sense. My general feeling is that, you know, the issue of working class culture and working class people in university systems is not a new one. You know, if you look around the expansion of New Labour's higher education in the 2000s, you know, it was identified, and there's a lot of good research done then. And a lot of very good ideas were suggested in terms of how you actually change higher education. They simply weren't ever engaged with or adopted. They were overlooked because the general culture and composition of higher education is dominated by people from more privileged backgrounds. And so they simply didn't see it as an issue. And so 20 years later, it almost feels like, you know, this is sort of the second wave attempt to try and address it, but I think it's for different reasons. And I think at the moment, the real issue here is the extent to which the government's agenda towards reforming higher education at the moment actually demonises and kind of almost segments working class young people and forces them into other routes, and particularly into the further education, you know, more vocational route. And there's this sort of assumption that middle class kids can do the academic topics and the working class kids can do the vocational stuff. And I really worry in terms of, you know, social science, the arts, the humanities, because these are areas that working class students excel in, and yet it seems to be that they're going to be the ones that will be cut and will be segmented, and will become the elite privileged few that will be able to study in these areas. Sorry, James, I'll pass on to you, mate.
Yeah, equally. I think it's really interesting. And I suppose outside of my academic studies and the day job, I spend a lot of time thinking about the structures and funding and the way higher education works. I suppose there's three things to me. The first one is I do struggle conceptually to imagine it because of the intersecting identities within being working class. So I can't necessarily picture what that looks like as a homogenous education institution. But I think beside that, there's probably two things for me. The first is because of the wider inequities in ability to access what are high tariff or Russell Group or however you want to call it universities. There is a risk that a lot of this divide already exists in a way that we just don't formally label it as such. So on the one hand, you might argue, well, if you had a specific institution that was set up in that way, you could provide better pastoral care, you could provide better support, etc., etc. I suppose my argument would be that we have a better chance of reforming the system we already have, rather than trying to reimagine what a new one could look like. However, where I do think there is an argument for new or different types of institutions is where there is current educational cold spots. And the reason I think that is for two reasons. The first is that we know working class students are less likely to travel away from home and to travel long distances. So it feels like an easier gap to close for a lot of students. And I think secondly, universities have enormous economic benefits in the places they're based. So UCU research out today shows that of the 30 university marginal seats, 1/3 of the people there identify as being reliant on the institution for their income in some way. So I don't think as an economic lever to bring about wider social inequalities, it is a bad idea to put specific institutions in places.
Brilliant, thanks, James. So there's like a delay at which I'm kind of scurrying across the mouse in order to press unmute. So just so you know, that's what it is. So we're just going to move on to the next question, which is from Becky from Reclaim. How do we bridge the elephant in the room around attaining the capital that pushes us into the middle class category, whilst we still feel and identify as working class? So if I come to Sarah first on that, if that's okay. So it's around, you know, the elephant in the room is people feel as though they're having to attain middle class capital in order to fit in, but then they still feel and identify as working class. So how do we bridge that elephant?
Yeah, I think for students, I think it's definitely, well, and for academics as well, it's definitely a problem. I think whilst I haven't got all the answers, I think we definitely do need to work on that. And I think part of that is working with institutions on how they can, like I said before, incorporate the attributes and the capitals that first in family and working class students bring to the table into the overall learning experience of the university, and not just, you know, as I say, put on these special programs which tries to make working class students, first in family students, to become the things that are traditionally valued in university. You know, we need to look at the things that are not traditionally valued in university and see them as positive attributes and forms of capital. Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody else has any comments on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of stuff needs to be done also in our own communities as well. And I don't know where that would come from right now exactly, but also I really feel like it is on both sides. And obviously on our side in our own communities comes from the pressure from above, but the idea of not having to push your kids away to achieve better, and how we can create these spaces for kids to be able to go away to study what they want to do at university and do the careers they want in their own communities, if that's what they want to do as well, and not the idea that once you leave, you'll be taking a step backwards. And I don't really know how, but that's where I think a lot of focus needs to be put. And I just wish I had more answers.
I think there's two things. So I think it is a wider problem that universities are probably ill fit to resolve in that sense. So in terms of how do you reconcile having middle class artifacts while you sort of maintain a profoundly working class identity, I think part of the problem has been the gradual cultural erosion of working class identities in the way they're represented more broadly. So if I think about my example of Saturday night, Sunday morning earlier, that book is about a lathe factory in Nottingham that makes bike parts. Now, the sort of current working class the working class literature is books like Douglas Coupland's Microserfs, or even if you look at sort of the realist works like James Bloodworth's Hired, it's all about negative experiences of being working class and the way that sort of our working conditions have got gradually worse and become fragmented. So you don't, I suppose, in a sense, see that same level of celebration of what a working class culture is. And part of the reason why this conference is so important is that you naturally feel disassociated from it, or even worse, that is, it's somehow something shameful in order to celebrate working class cultures. And then I think there's also that negative connotation that being working class is somehow being captured, and that you can't be liberal or working class, or left-wing and working class, or sort of communitarian and working class. So I think that's an issue. I think secondly, one of the things that I've found is that I feel, as I said earlier, unmoored and uncomfortable in my own working class versus middle class identity. But I suppose one of the ways I've kept interested in that is that why I would say a lot of my cultural engagement is profoundly middle class, the causes I'm still interested in come from a working class sensibility. And in my head, that allows me to feel like I can reconcile those two things in a way that I couldn't otherwise. That is not to say it is easy, and I often feel conflicted about it.
Andy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In some ways we come at it in a sort of rather critical and possibly even negative way, in which we sort of think about, you know, some of the issues about authenticity and the way in which we fit in. You know, I can go from hello, Dr. Andy Mycock, BBC, through to hello, I'm from Derbyshire and I used to be a welder in the space of one sentence. And I always used to think that was a weakness. I'm starting to see it as a strength, because it allows me to navigate and negotiate spaces in a way that I never thought, you know, in a positive sense before. And yet at the same time, you know, as Steph said, you know, I'm one of those that ended up in therapy to try and navigate through some of the issues that this transition makes. And in some senses, I think there's a need to probably accept that this isn't a uniquely working class experience. You know, I come from a background where my father was most decidedly downwardly mobile, i.e. ended up as a lorry driver, which was wonderful for him, and he enjoyed his life. But at the same time, he had a constant sense of shame in some ways. And I think that is somewhere where there's a question about, you know, this needs to be both a conversation about, you know, working class transition and working class hybridity, but at the same time recognise that these kind of conversations are taking place on a much wider scale across university. And in that sense, you know, I think the core in this, and I think this is where it gets back to Becky's question, is that there is something here about privilege and how privilege is linked to, you know, to different kinds of cultural and economic and political power. And I think this conference really feels like a sort of turning point. There's a sense in which this is a turning point in which this can start to become a more mainstream conversation across higher education.
Brilliant, thanks Andy. There's a really interesting question by Adele Phillips here. It's a point about inequalities. So the north-south divide is mentioned a lot, and actually our work is completely centred around a lot of that. But coming from Kent, we have some of the most impoverished wards in the UK. Seaside towns experience a unique set of problems. How do we do more to develop a more united discourse? I guess some of that also comes back to kind of some of the stereotypes around working class and where working class people might be likely to come from, or what people expect a working class person to look like. So maybe I might first just go to Andy on that, if that's all right.
It's a really, really good question. It kind of links to something that James said about, you know, the need to make sure that, you know, we move out of the idea that universities are in particular spaces and places, and realise that that means that, you know, if you're in a coastal town, or if you're in a place that is, you know, politically isolated by poor transport or just by geography, that, you know, particularly working class young people have a real sense of disconnection with the whole idea of higher education, because, you know, there's a lot of evidence there that distance matters, both in the terms of the distances that people are prepared to travel to go to university, but also that sense in which universities have an effect which comes back to where they live. And in that sense, yeah, there is a need. You can't obviously put a university in every town and city, you know, across the country, although that would be a lovely position to be in. But there is a sense in which, you know, some of the ideas in which, you know, university colleges and other things where you sought to actually realise and extend higher education out into further education in other areas were dropped. And they were dropped largely because higher education is now such a commercialised, marketised entity that it wasn't seen to be economically viable. Well, I think this kind of overlooks the idea that, you know, higher education has a social contribution towards society, and it has a sense in which it has also an effect in terms of, you know, much beyond the actual education that takes place on the campus itself. And I'm aware of that. You know, I'm based in Huddersfield. Yeah, I spend a lot of time in Dewsbury and Batley and around that part of West Yorkshire. And, you know, the university effect is minimal there, whereas in Huddersfield it has a profound effect. And so I think there is a question there. You know, there is a connection with regionalism and localism and the way in which that connects with different groups of working class young people. You know, it's a very different experience possibly for someone living in Manchester who's from a working class community than someone, say, living on the Lincolnshire coast where there isn't that same connection to it. And I think policymakers need to think about that.
Thanks, Andy. James, do you want to say something on this? It's kind of your area.
Yeah, I suppose I think it's a question much bigger than I can possibly answer, because it links into not only how do we feel about ourselves, but what is the sort of structures in the places that we're based. I suppose my three predominant thoughts are: is the division between regions, what's the bigger division? Is it between regions in and of themselves and their unique characteristics, or the economic status of regions and how they relate to each other? So, for example, is there more in common between South Yorkshire and Kent than there is between Essex and Buckingham, for example, of which I don't know the answer to? I suppose the second bit that occurs to me is that if we are talking about working class experiences in the round, there's no homogenous working class experience, but there is a sense of working class solidarity. And I think how we bring those experiences beyond regional boundaries is probably the key one. I suppose thirdly, and I'll finish on this one, part of it is about trust. And how do we make the case that as people in the places we live, we are best placed to make decisions over our own lives? Part of this is the argument about devolution and what powers do we give to people within combined authorities. But part of this should be more broadly of how do we have a proper participative democracy of which our institutions, our universities, local authorities are part, and give people genuine power and influence to change them.
Thanks, James. I think Andy's disappeared. I mean, we never know what's going to happen with Andy. He may reappear. We'll find out soon. So I think we've probably got time for one more question, if that's all right with everybody, before we wrap up. And it was from Cecilia Muldoon. So I'll just read it because it is quite long and I don't want to lose any sense of what she's trying to capture there. So looking at the access gaps in higher education in my PhD work, with a view to informing how my university could work better with the local community and how institutions need to change, not working class students. Any ideas yet on how we do this, despite all the money they spend on WP? I don't know what that means. James?
Widening participation.
Okay. I feel like they don't get it, and I'm not listening to the very people they claim to want to help, but impose top-down ideas and activities. So it kind of does link with a lot of what we were talking about, and particularly James' last point there around democracy and giving people trust and some ownership over their own lives. But basically, you know, how do we actually work with the local community? And I guess it goes back a little bit to the point I made before about where does the change need to happen? My view of the change needs to happen within the institution. And has anybody got any ideas or come across any kind of research for how that might happen? Well, I'll go to all three of you because Andy's gone. Maybe we'll start with Sarah, if that's all right.
Yeah, it is a difficult one. And I think James is probably more equipped to maybe offer such solutions. Yeah, come back to me in a moment. Let me just have a moment to think.
We'll go to you then, James, if that's okay.
Thanks, Steph. I don't know if I have the solutions, but it's something I think about quite a lot. And I suppose to me there's two levels about this. So firstly is how do you involve people in formal decision-making spaces within the universities that exist outside of the university community? So the University of Lincoln's work, called the Permeable University, is really good on this front. And I suppose there's two ways you can think about this. So is there opportunities to involve representatives of the community within your formal decision-making structures as universities? So at its most simple, this might be things like elect them onto councils or making sure recruitment for council reaches out to them. Or it might involve things like when you are developing education strategies, involving community representatives directly within those groups. And it's something which we've considered particularly with relationships in our colleges. But there's no reason why you can do wider and more consultative work with your local working class communities. Again, hedging my bets as I always do to say there is no homogenous working class community. Secondly, I think there is a need for more informal interactions between institutions and the places they're based. So that is things like having the pro-vice chancellors, vice chancellors, heads of departments going out into community groups and talking about what the university does. There is something about being present and being visible. We often get accused of being the institution on the hill, which, while I don't think is a fair archetype, we won't change that until we go to the spaces where people are already organising. And I was thinking about that as two key principles.
Yeah, I definitely second that actually, about engaging and going out into the public, not expecting people to come to the universities. I think that's one of the problems, is that when we try and engage communities, we often expect people to come to us.
And can I give Fraser the last word on this one? I'd be really interested to know, Fraser, in kind of your recent experience of being at uni, were there any good examples of where they did this? Or were there any kind of really obvious places where they could have done it better or done it at all, where you kind of just thought, like, why are they not doing this?
I actually have so Edinburgh Uni is obviously the Fringe is here. It's the biggest arts festival in the world, and the university makes a lot of money from renting out all its buildings and being part of the Fringe, and yet somehow does not seem to be part of the Fringe. And it just seems every year to me, because I am always here for the Fringe, I love it, but every year I see it and I'm like, you have all this opportunity, you have all these spaces, but actually what they do is they oust students from student accommodation so they can set them up as little hotels where they charge triple the price. Like it is, it's not something that I've seen too often. Although I would say one thing is it's quite student-based and student-organised. There's a lot of societies here, and that's what pushes a lot of this inclusion. So I know just as I was leaving uni, NorthSoc, the Northern Society, again, not to make it homogenous that, you know, all Northerners are working class or all working class people are Northern, but from what I know of my friend who's a member of the committee, like actually that is quite important and big, and it is a bit tricky because it becomes this blur of the two. But that it's student-led here that I see which is pushing it, which is not being picked up by the official university. And that's, I think, where it's going wrong. It's not supporting the students to create these spaces for themselves either.
Okay, thanks Fraser, thanks Steph, thanks Andy, Sarah, thanks James. It was absolutely brilliant. What a way to start this morning. So I just want to say a massive thanks to you guys for that. That was just amazing, and thank you for making Twitter and chat go crazy.